I still remember the way he would walk onto a stage like he owned every soul in the room. The lights would hit, the crowd would lean forward, and within seconds, laughter would explode like a chain reaction no one could stop. He didn't ease into it. He didn't warm people up. He attacked, and somehow people loved him for it. That was the strange magic of Don Rickles. He could insult you, tear you apart in front of hundreds, even thousands, and you'd still thank him afterward. But behind that laughter, behind the perfectly timed punchlines and that sharp, fearless delivery, there was always something else hiding, something colder, something real. Because for all the jokes he threw around so casually, there were moments, quiet ones, where you could feel that not every jab came from humor. Some came from somewhere deeper, somewhere personal. And there was one person in particular, someone who stood out from all the rest, who wasn't just a target for laughs. He was a target for something much more serious. People often talk about comedians as if they live in a world separate from everyone else, like their job is just to make people laugh and nothing more. But that's never been true, especially not for Rickles. He didn't just observe the world. He judged it. He dissected it. He had a way of looking at people that went beyond surface-level charm. He could see through personas, through carefully crafted images, through the illusions that Hollywood loved to build. And once he saw something he didn't respect, he didn't forget it. That was the difference between him and everyone else. Most entertainers played along with the system. Rickles didn't. He stood in the middle of it and threw punches. And while most of those punches were wrapped in humor, there were a few that carried real weight. The kind of weight that doesn't come from a joke, but from a long-standing resentment. What made it even more complicated was that Rickles wasn't the kind of man who openly admitted his grudges. On the surface, everything he did could be explained away as comedy. If he insulted someone, it was just part of the act. If he went too far, people laughed it off. That was the shield he used his entire career. It allowed him to say things that no one else could say and get away with it. But a shield can only hide so much. Over time, patterns start to appear. Certain names come up more often than others. Certain jokes feel sharper, more pointed, less playful. And that's when people began to notice that there was something different about the way he treated one particular figure. It wasn't just comedy anymore. It felt like something unresolved. Behind the scenes, the tension was even more obvious. Stories started to circulate. Quiet at first, shared between insiders. People who had been in the same rooms, the same backstage areas, the same late-night conversations where the real thoughts came out. They described a different side of Rickles. Not the quick-witted performer, but the man who didn't laugh as much when the spotlight was gone. The man who had opinions, strong ones, about people he believed didn't deserve the praise they were getting. And when that one name came up, the tone would shift, the jokes would stop, the humor would fade. What remained wasn't anger in the explosive sense, but something colder, a kind of disappointment mixed with frustration, like watching someone succeed for all the wrong reasons. It's easy to assume that in a world like entertainment, rivalries are common and often exaggerated. People compete, they clash, they move on. But this wasn't one of those simple rivalries. This was something that seemed to grow over time, fed by years of observation, quiet judgment, and moments that stuck in Rickles' mind longer than they should have. He wasn't someone who forgot easily. If he believed something about a person, he held on to it. And in this case, what he believed was that this man represented everything he disliked about the industry, not just as an individual, but as a symbol, someone who, in Rickles' eyes, had been lifted up by forces that had nothing to do with true talent. There were moments on stage when the mask would slip, just enough for people to notice. The crowd would still laugh, but there was an edge to the delivery, a pause that lingered a second too long, a line that didn't feel entirely like a joke. And those who paid close attention could tell that this wasn't just performance anymore. It was something closer to a message, delivered in a language only Rickles could use. He never said it outright. He didn't need to. The way he spoke, the way he looked at his target, the way he returned to the same themes again and again, it all added up to something that couldn't be ignored. The strange part is that the person on the receiving end rarely responded in the same way. While Rickles sharpened his words, the other side remained calm, almost indifferent. That only seemed to make things worse. Because if there's one thing that fuels resentment, it's the feeling that your criticism isn't being taken seriously, that it's being brushed off as nothing more than noise. And for someone like Rickles, who built his entire identity around being heard, being understood, that kind of reaction didn't sit well. It turned what might have been a passing irritation into something more permanent. As the years went by, the gap between public perception and private reality grew wider. To the audience, everything was still part of the show. They saw a fearless comedian doing what he did best, pushing boundaries, saying the unsayable, making people laugh at things they normally wouldn't. But behind that, there was a narrative that very few people fully understood, a narrative about authenticity, about what it means to truly earn your place, about the difference between being celebrated and being deserving of that celebration. Rickles had strong opinions about those things, and he wasn't shy about expressing them, just not always directly. What makes this story even more compelling is that Rickles himself was a man full of contradictions. Off stage, he was known to be kind, even gentle. People who met him in private settings often described him as warm, respectful, and deeply loyal. That contrast made his on-stage persona even more fascinating. How could someone so sharp, so ruthless in front of an audience, be so different behind the scenes? The answer lies in understanding that his comedy wasn't just an act. It was an outlet, a way to say things he couldn't say otherwise. And in this particular case, it became a way to express feelings he never fully addressed in the open. As he got older, something began to change. The energy was still there, the timing still perfect, but there was also a sense of reflection creeping into his performances. He started looking back more, talking about the past, revisiting moments that had shaped him. And with that reflection came a kind of honesty that hadn't always been present before. Not the blunt, aggressive honesty of his younger years, but something quieter, more thoughtful. It was during this time that the idea of unresolved tension started to feel less like speculation and more like reality. People close to him noticed it too. Conversations would drift toward the past, toward people he had encountered, worked with, or clashed with. And when that one name came up, the same pattern appeared. A shift in tone, a pause, a look that suggested there was more he wanted to say, but chose not to. It wasn't fear holding him back. It was something else. Perhaps the realization that some things, once said plainly, can't be taken back or softened with humor. For a man who had built his career on walking that fine line, crossing it completely may have felt like breaking his own rules. In the end, what makes this story so powerful isn't just the idea of hatred or rivalry. It's what that feeling represents. For Rickles, it wasn't just about one person. It was about an entire system that he believed rewarded the wrong things. It was about the frustration of watching authenticity lose to image, substance lose to style. And while he may have directed much of that frustration at a single individual, the truth is that the target was much bigger than that. When you look back at his career, it's clear that he changed the way people think about comedy. He showed that laughter doesn't always have to be comfortable, that it can come from tension, from truth, from saying things people would rather avoid. But he also showed that behind every joke, there's perspective, a point of view shaped by personal experiences, beliefs, and sometimes unresolved feelings. And in this case, those feelings never fully disappeared. They lingered, just beneath the surface, hidden behind decades of laughter. By the time he reached the final years of his life, the stage was no longer just a place for performance. It became a place for reflection, for looking back at everything he had seen, everything he had said, and everything he had chosen not to say. And while he never fully laid it all out in plain terms, the pieces were there for anyone willing to look closely. The patterns, the tone, the repetition, it all pointed to something deeper than comedy, something that had been there all along. And maybe that's the most revealing part of all, that even someone as bold, as fearless as Don Rickles had things he kept buried beneath the surface, not because he couldn't express them, but because he understood the power of leaving certain things unsaid. Because sometimes the truth isn't in what's spoken directly. It's what's hinted at, repeated, and felt over time. And in this case, that truth tells a story far more complex than simple humor. A story about perception, frustration, and a quiet, enduring sense that not everything in the spotlight is what it seems.